This 1870 portrait looked joyful, but the enslaved boy's eyes told another story. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of the Virginia Museum of History as Marcus Hayes carefully unwrapped the latest acquisition for the upcoming Reconstruction-era exhibition. At 42, Marcus had spent nearly 2 decades as a curator, but something about this particular photograph made him pause. The gilt frame was ornate, expensive for its time, and the sepia-toned image showed a prosperous merchant family posed in their Richmond parlor in 1870. The family appeared jubilant. Jonathan Whitmore, the patriarch, stood proudly with his hand on an elaborately carved chair. His wife, Elizabeth, sat with perfect posture, her silk dress catching the photographer's light. Their 3 children were arranged around them, the girls in lace collars, the boy in a miniature suit. Everything about the composition spoke of post-war prosperity, of a South rebuilding itself, but it was the figure at the edge of the frame that drew Marcus's attention. A young black boy, perhaps 12 or 13 years old, stood slightly behind the family. He wore simple clothing that contrasted sharply with the Whitmore's finery. His posture was rigid, almost unnaturally still, and while the family smiled broadly at the camera, the boy's expression was carefully neutral. Marcus leaned closer, studying the image through his magnifying glass. The photograph had come from an estate sale in Church Hill, one of Richmond's oldest neighborhoods. The seller's notes mentioned it had been stored in an attic for generations, forgotten until the house was being cleared. Marcus had purchased it specifically because it showed the complex dynamics of the Reconstruction period, that turbulent time after slavery's abolition when the South struggled to redefine itself. His assistant Jennifer approached with coffee. "That's a beautiful piece," she said, glancing at the portrait. "Perfect for the exhibition. Shows how some families were rebuilding their fortunes." Marcus nodded absently, but his attention remained fixed on the boy's face. There was something there, something he couldn't quite articulate yet, something that didn't match the celebration captured in the rest of the photograph. Marcus spent the afternoon preparing the photograph for digital archiving. The museum's new high-resolution scanner could capture details invisible to the naked eye, preserving historical artifacts for future researchers. As the image loaded onto his computer screen, he began the routine process of examining every inch of the photograph for damage, discoloration, or historical annotations. He zoomed in on the Whitmore family first, noting the texture of the fabrics, the style of Elizabeth's brooch, the type of chair that indicated their social status. Then he moved to the boy. At 400% magnification, Marcus froze. The boy's wrists, partially visible beneath his sleeves, showed distinct marks. Not bruises exactly, but the kind of circular scarring that came from repeated friction. Chain marks. Marcus had seen similar patterns in photographs of enslaved people taken before 1865, but this portrait was dated 1870, 5 years after the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. He zoomed in on the boy's face. The eyes that had seemed merely solemn at first glance now revealed something far more disturbing. There was no light in them, no reflection of the family's joy. Instead, they held a kind of hollow exhaustion that Marcus recognized from other historical images. The look of someone enduring, surviving, but not living. Marcus sat back, his heart racing. He pulled up the seller's documentation again, searching for any mention of the boy's identity. Nothing. The estate inventory listed the photograph simply as Whitmore family portrait, circa 1870. Jennifer returned to his office with authentication paperwork. "Something wrong?" she asked, noticing his expression. Marcus turned the monitor toward her. "Look at his wrists. Look at his eyes." She leaned in, and he watched her face change as she saw what he had seen. "But slavery ended in 1865, Marcus finished. 5 years before this was taken." They stared at each other as the implication settled between them. Marcus couldn't sleep that night. The boy's face haunted him, those empty eyes that had witnessed something the cheerful portrait tried to conceal. By dawn, he was already at the Virginia Historical Society's research library, requesting access to their Reconstruction-era records. The librarian, an elderly woman named Dorothy, who had worked there for 40 years, brought him boxes of materials related to Richmond's merchant families. "Looking for anything specific?" she asked. "The Whitmore family, Church Hill area, 1870s. Dorothy's expression shifted slightly. "Jonathan Whitmore, tobacco merchant. Made a fortune during Reconstruction." She paused. "There are some labor contracts in Box 7 you might find interesting." Marcus worked through the morning, piecing together the Whitmore family history. Jonathan had owned a modest plantation before the war, with 18 enslaved people documented in the 1860 census. After the Confederate defeat, he had pivoted quickly, establishing himself as a tobacco broker. By 1868, he was one of Richmond's wealthiest men. In Box 7, Marcus found what Dorothy had hinted at, a stack of apprenticeship contracts dated between 1866 and 1872. These documents, written in elaborate legal language, bound freed miners to various Richmond families for terms ranging from 5 to 10 years. In exchange for room, board, and moral instruction, the children would provide domestic and agricultural labor. The contracts were signed by county officials, apparently legal and proper. But as Marcus read through them, a disturbing pattern emerged. Every single child named in these contracts was black. Every single family receiving them was white. and the terms of service were almost identical to those of slavery, with one exception. They weren't called slaves. Then he found it. Halfway through the stack, a contract dated March 1868. Thomas, Negro boy, approximately 11 years of age, bound to Jonathan Whitmore for a term of 8 years. No last name, no parents mentioned, just Thomas. Marcus pulled the photograph up on his laptop and compared the date. If Thomas had been 11 in 1868, he would have been about 13 in 1870, exactly the age of the boy in the portrait. Marcus spent the next 3 days immersed in Virginia's post-war legal records, and what he discovered made him physically ill. The apprenticeship system wasn't an isolated practice. It was widespread, systematic, and perfectly legal under Reconstruction-era Virginia law. After the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, Southern states had quickly passed black codes, laws that specifically targeted freed black people. One of the most insidious was the apprenticeship law, which allowed county courts to bind black children to white guardians if their parents were deemed unable to support them. The definition of unable was left deliberately vague, applied almost exclusively to black families, and enforced by white judges. Marcus found court records showing that in some Virginia counties, officials had systematically separated black children from their parents immediately after emancipation. The justification was always the same. The parents were poor, unemployed, or vagrant. The reality was that many of these parents were formerly enslaved people who had just gained their freedom and were trying to establish themselves in an economy designed to exclude them. The children were then distributed to white families who needed laborers, but no longer had legal access to enslaved people. The contracts bound them until age 18 or 21, during which time they received no wages, couldn't leave, and had no legal recourse if mistreated. If they ran away, they could be captured and returned, just like before abolition. Marcus found newspaper articles from 1867 defending the system. One editorial in the Richmond Examiner declared, "These children are being saved from lives of idleness and vice. They are learning valuable trades and moral values from upstanding Christian families." He also found something else: complaints. The Freedmen's Bureau, a federal agency created to help formerly enslaved people, had documented hundreds of protests from black parents trying to get their children back. Letters written in careful, halting script. "Please, sir, they took my boy Thomas, and I don't know where he is." Marcus's hands trembled as he photographed the documents. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Marcus had posted a query on a genealogy form used by historians researching African-American family histories, describing the photograph and the contract he'd found. Within 24 hours, he received a message from Dr. Angela Reeves, a professor at Howard University whose research focused on Reconstruction-era child labor. "I think I know who your Thomas might be," her email began. She had been studying Freedmen's Bureau records and had found a case file that matched the timeline. She attached scanned documents that Marcus read with growing anger and sorrow. Thomas's full story began to emerge from the pages. His mother, whose name was recorded as Letty, had been enslaved on a small farm in Henrico County. When freedom came in 1865, she had taken Thomas, then 8 years old, and moved to Richmond, hoping to find work. She had found employment as a laundress, barely earning enough to rent a single room. In March 1868, a county official appeared at her door. A neighbor, a white neighbor, had reported that Thomas was roaming the streets unsupervised while his mother worked. The official declared Letty unable to properly care for her son and took Thomas that same day. The apprenticeship contract was signed by a judge who had never met either of them, Dr. Reeves had found 3 letters Letty had written to the Freedmen's Bureau, each more desperate than the last. In the first, dated April 1868, she explained what had happened and begged for help getting Thomas back. In the second, written 6 months later, she described going to the Whitmore house and being turned away by their servants. She wasn't allowed to see her son. The third letter, dated January 1870, was the most heartbreaking. Letty wrote that she had finally been permitted a brief visit with Thomas. "He don't smile no more," she wrote in careful script. "He work from dawn and sleep in the kitchen. They feed him, but he looks so tired, so old in his eyes." January 1870, just months before the photograph was taken. Marcus knew he needed to understand more about the Whitmore family and their household. He returned to the Historical Society, this time requesting city directories, tax records, and any personal papers that might have survived. What he found painted a picture of a family obsessed with rebuilding their social status. Jonathan Whitmore's tobacco brokerage thrived in the chaotic post-war economy. He had connections throughout the South and relationships with northern buyers, eager to restart the flow of Virginia tobacco. By 1870, he owned the Church Hill Mansion, employed several servants, and was a prominent member of St. John's Episcopal Church. But the financial records told another story. Marcus discovered that despite their apparent wealth, the Whitmores were deeply in debt. Jonathan had borrowed heavily to establish his business, and the lavish lifestyle his wife insisted on maintaining strained their resources constantly. They needed laborers, but couldn't afford to pay wages. The apprenticeship system solved that problem perfectly. Marcus found household accounts that listed expenses for the servants, but noted that only the adult white servants received wages. Thomas and 2 other apprentice children, both black girls, ages 10 and 14, received only room and board. The room, Marcus discovered from an insurance assessment of the property, was a space in the basement with no windows. A diary entry from Elizabeth Whitmore, found in a collection of women's correspondence, mentioned the photograph. "We commissioned Mr. Peterson to take a family portrait today. Jonathan insisted the house servants be included to show how well we treat our people. I suppose it makes us appear benevolent. Our people." The phrase made Marcus's stomach turn. Slavery had been abolished for 5 years, but the language, the attitude, the fundamental relationship remained unchanged. He found one more detail in the photographer's business ledger. William Peterson had noted, "Whitmore commission. Boy in photograph would not smile despite repeated requests." Mrs. Whitmore insisted he remain in frame. Thomas had been forced to stand there, to be included in this performance of family happiness, while his eyes told the truth. As Marcus dug deeper, he began finding connections that suggested the Whitmore case wasn't isolated, but part of a larger network. He discovered that Jonathan Whitmore served on the County Apprenticeship Board, the very committee that approved the binding of black children to white families. In essence, he had helped create and maintain the system from which he personally benefited. Marcus found minutes from board meetings where Whitmore argued that Negro children needed the civilizing influence of white households, and that their parents, being newly freed and unsophisticated, couldn't properly raise them. The hypocrisy was staggering. Whitmore and men like him had created an economic system that kept black families in poverty, then used that poverty as justification for taking their children. But Marcus also found contradictions that complicated the narrative. A receipt showed that Jonathan Whitmore had paid for a doctor to treat Thomas when he fell ill in 1871. Another document indicated he had arranged for Thomas to learn basic reading and writing, something rarely provided to apprentice children and technically required by the contracts, but usually ignored. Were these signs of genuine care or merely investments in protecting valuable labor? Marcus struggled with the question. He found similar contradictions in other cases. White families who treated apprentice children with relative kindness, even affection, while still maintaining them in bondage. The complexity was uncomfortable, but important to acknowledge. What remained clear, however, was that regardless of how individual families treated apprentice children, the system itself was fundamentally unjust. These children had no choice, no freedom, and no legal protection. Their lives were controlled completely by families who had no biological or emotional connection to them. Marcus discovered that the system finally began to collapse in 1871 when federal courts started ruling the apprenticeship laws unconstitutional. But enforcement was slow and inconsistent. Many children remained bound to their guardians for years afterward. The final pieces fell into place when Marcus connected with a descendant researcher named James Miller, who had been tracing his family history back to slavery. James had found references to his great-great-great-grandmother Letty in church records, and had been trying to find out what happened to her son Thomas. Together, they uncovered Thomas's complete story through a combination of census records, church documents, and a remarkable find, a small notebook that had been preserved by Thomas's descendants, passed down through generations, with the instruction that it must never be destroyed. The notebook contained Thomas's own words, written in the careful script of someone who had taught himself to write better than his basic lessons allowed. The entries began in 1872, when he was 15 years old, and continued sporadically for several years. "I remember Mama's face when they took me," one entry read. "I remember how she cried, and how I wanted to cry too, but the man said I had to be brave and good. I tried to be good. I work hard every day and I don't complain, but I want to go home." Another entry, dated 1873. Mrs. Whitmore had them take the portrait down from the parlor. She said it made her uncomfortable. "I understand why. Every time I look at that picture, I remember that day. How they made me stand there. How they wanted me to smile. How I couldn't make my face do it no matter how hard I tried." The entries described years of relentless labor, rising before dawn to light fires, carrying water, serving meals, cleaning, running errands, working in the tobacco warehouse. Thomas wrote about missing his mother, about brief secret visits she managed to arrange through sympathetic church members, about the other apprentice children and how they supported each other. But he also wrote about learning to read better, about books he borrowed and read by candlelight, about dreams of freedom that kept him going. In 1874, when he turned 17, Thomas learned that the apprenticeship laws had been declared unconstitutional. He was free to leave. Marcus and James stood together in the museum's archive room, the photograph displayed on a large monitor beside them. They had spent weeks piecing together Thomas's story, and now they understood the complete truth behind those haunted eyes. Thomas had left the Whitmore household in late 1874, returning to his mother. He had worked as a laborer, saved money, and eventually opened a small carpentry shop. He married in 1878 and had 5 children. He lived until 1932, dying at 75 years old, surrounded by grandchildren who knew pieces of his story but never the full depth of what he had endured. The notebook had been given to his oldest daughter with a single instruction. "Remember what they did to us. Remember how they tried to keep us enslaved even after slavery ended. Remember so it never happens again." James, Thomas's great-great-great-grandson, had carried that notebook across the country, protecting it, preserving it. "My grandmother told me that Thomas would wake up screaming sometimes, even as an old man," he said quietly. She said he dreamed about being back in the house, being trapped, being unable to leave. Marcus thought about the system that had created Thomas's trauma. Over 30,000 black children in Virginia alone had been apprenticed between 1865 and 1871, tens of thousands more across the South. Entire generations had been stolen from their families, their childhoods converted into forced labor, their freedom delayed by legal manipulation, and it had been hidden in plain sight, documented in court records and photographs, disguised as benevolence and assistance. The Whitmore family portrait, meant to showcase their prosperity and generosity, had instead preserved evidence of their participation in the systematic oppression. What happened to the Whitmores? James asked. Marcus had researched that too. Jonathan's business collapsed in the 1873 financial panic. The family lost the Church Hill mansion and moved to a smaller house, their children scattered, their descendants eventually leaving Virginia. The family name faded from prominence, but Thomas's family had survived, grown, thrived, despite everything designed to break them. The exhibition opened on a cool October morning in 2024. Marcus had titled it Hidden Bondage, Reconstructions, Forgotten Children, and Thomas's story formed its centerpiece. The photograph hung in a place of honor, but now it was surrounded by context. Letty's letters, Thomas's notebook, the apprenticeship contracts, court records, and newspaper articles defending and criticizing the system. Most importantly, James and other descendants of apprenticed children had contributed family histories, photographs, and documents that showed what had happened to these children after they finally gained true freedom. The exhibition told a story of survival, resistance, and resilience. On opening day, over 300 people attended, including several families who had discovered their own ancestors had been apprenticed. Many wept as they read Thomas's words and recognized their own family stories and his experience. The photograph that had hidden the truth for 154 years was now revealing it. A reporter asked Marcus what he hoped people would take from the exhibition. He thought about Thomas's eyes in that photograph, about the trauma carried across generations, about the systems of oppression that adapted and survived even when laws changed. "I hope they understand that freedom on paper isn't the same as freedom in reality," he said. "I hope they see how laws can be twisted to maintain oppression under new names. And I hope they recognize that every old photograph, every historical document, might contain hidden stories of injustice that need to be uncovered and acknowledged." James stood beside the photograph, his hand resting on the frame. "Thomas wanted people to remember," he said. "Not just to be angry, but to understand, to see how these systems worked so we can recognize when they try to come back in new forms." The exhibition would travel to museums across the country, and Thomas's story would reach millions. The boy whose eyes had held so much pain in 1870 had finally found his voice. And through Marcus's dedication and James's preservation of family memory, that voice was speaking truth to history. The photograph that was meant to celebrate a family's prosperity had instead become a testament to a child's endurance and a reminder of the work still needed to achieve true justice. Thomas's legacy was restored, and his truth could never be hidden again.